the CSS Manassas, which we see right there, was actually the first ironclad not only to get into the water, but also to fight a battle. I'm not saying it fought it well, but I'm just saying it was the first of those things. And it's all because of down in New Orleans, as we know, was the largest city in the South, 120,000 residents, and also a manufacturing center, a major port. So the Confederates, when they looked at what was happening and how they needed to maintain their war effort, they looked and said, well, the Federals are going to come down the Mississippi River to attack us, but they didn't think that the Federals would also come up the river. So it was a pincer movement. And they had to get themselves together to be able to thwart either of those movements. Now, I have to say that down in New Orleans, one of the big problems is the commander was General Mansfield Lovell, and the commander of the naval forces is a man known as Flag Officer George Hollins. Hollins had already made fame during the war as he was the man that captured the St. Nicholas at the very beginning of the war. And I think I wrote a blog about it if you want to learn more about it. But the trouble is there are so many people in New Orleans that want to have their fingers in the pie, so that you have the Confederate Navy, you have the Louisiana Navy, and then you have the River Defense Force. And all of this was supposed to be controlled by George Hollins, and it was hard to, the stubborn ship captain said, well, you can't tell me what to do. I'm a civilian. And so this is pretty bad. Nevertheless, Hollins was so vocal to the level of insubordination that they'll take him out of New Orleans after he has proven himself to understand the concepts of war on the Mississippi. And the concepts of the war on the Mississippi is all about ironclads. And the ironclads had to rule the waves. And of course, in the North, beginning in October of 1861, they start building ironclads up in Cartelet and St. Louis. And the Confederates likewise start to build ironclads down in New Orleans, which was the CSS Mississippi, and then also the CSS Louisiana. Also in Memphis, where a Navy Yard existed before the Civil War. That's where we're going to see they build the CSS Arkansas and start to build an ironclad called the CSS Tennessee, but they have to burn it at the stocks because the Federals are coming. Steamships allow you to go very fast. So basically, the Confederate Naval Command, the Navy Yard there is commanded by Commander William C. Whittle Sr. His son is also a very active participant in the war. And the Confederate Navy forces are commanded by a man known as John K. Mitchell, who's from Norfolk. All these guys were long-term Navy veterans. And so they were really putting their force into building these two ironclads in New Orleans. And then they also buy whatever ship they can find. They'll buy ships like the CSS McRae and convert them into gunboats, or as we like to call them, cottonclads. Now, I don't know about you all, but cotton and iron, I think there's a difference. Now, we have to realize that all these small boats were like a mosquito fleet, because the New Orleans is going to depend on fortifications below the city itself, right above the head of the passes, to actually defend the city. And so I have to say that this is the Manassas, of course. And the Manassas got a pretty good story. And I'll get back to some of these plannings and things. But I have to say that the Manassas was actually a concept created by the secretary of the New Orleans Pilots Benefit Association. His name was Captain John Stevenson. And so he went up to see Jefferson Davis when he was still in Montgomery, Alabama, and said, I want to build an ironclad. Davis says, go for it. And he says, I want my ironclad to be a privateer. Davis says, go for it. Well, fortunately for Stevenson, he had to raise the money to build this craft. And actually, within 3 weeks, he raises $100,000 in subscriptions. Now, good fortune comes by way of Stevenson, because another privateer, the Ivy, which later becomes the CSS Ivy, will capture a tug known as the Enoch Train right off the coast of Louisiana. Now, this was a very powerful steam tug with a heavy reinforced bow, because it was also an icebreaker. Okay, so we think about that reinforced bow and we realize what a perfect ship to transform into an ironclad. Now, basically, the vessel's superstructure was all cut down. It was taken to a shipyard in Algiers, Louisiana, and there they're going to put this convex cover on it. It's called a turtleback, right? Because of the rounding, the galena features some of this type of iron plating. The big problem is that the convex shield is made out of 16 inches of pine and live oak, but it's topped by 1.25 inches of iron. Now, nobody really figured out that how much iron was going to be really needed on these boats, because that is not a sufficient amount of iron. But nevertheless, this ship is that convex shield is supposed to allow shot to bounce off of the turtleback so that they didn't need as much armor, they so thought. Now, the bow was extended, of course, and strengthened to mount its cast iron ram that was just below the waterline, exceeding 6 feet away from the Manassas. It was then armed, as you can see up there, with a 64-pounder gun. Now, I want to tell you, that gun would later be replaced by a 32-pounder. But that gun, the only way to reload it is to go out on the deck of the ship and reload the gun. And it did not have any traversing power. So you had to turn the ship to shoot at what you wanted to shoot at. Not great planning, I have to say. It did have a port shutter, which really they never used. Now, they created a series of pumps installed to blow steam and scalding water across the ironclad shield to repel any boarders. You think you can get on top of it and go into the hole? Well, they had hoses to scald people who were trying to do that. The ship was named, of course, in honor of the Confederate victory on 21 July, 1861. It had been expanded into a ship that could take, it had a draft of 7 feet. And even though the engines were in need of overhaul, the Confederates wanted to use it anyway. So the speed for this vessel is estimated at 4 to 6 knots. Now, that could barely stem the tide in the Mississippi. So that gives it additional problems. Now, sometimes you'll see pictures of the Manassas with 2 smokestacks, sometimes just with 1. Now, according to some of the eyewitnesses, it just had 1 stack. And so, so this ship is going to be launched, get this date, 12 September 1861. What's happening elsewhere? Well, you got the Ironclad board meeting saying, oh my gosh, the Confederates are building ironclads. They actually now have one in the water. And that is really pretty important. Now, of course, some people called it a beached whale. Some people called it a long floating cigar. And most of them called it a turtle. And so you get the idea of a turtle. I never thought much of the beached whale idea, but someone who walked into this room today said, it looks like a beached whale. And I'm like, of course, you ruined my quote. Anyway, so the Confederates have put together quite a force, but it's not effective force because all these ships are wooden. They're commanded by Flag Officer George Hollins. Hollins had fought on the War of 1812 and the Second Barbary War with Stephen Decatur. So he understands action. And he also, right before the war begins, he's commander of a steam paddler known as the USS Susquehanna. It is one of those ships that went to Japan to open the door to Japan. So he's a well-known officer. He actually, as I've said, most famous for his capture of the Nicholas, which he did with Richard Thomas Zorana and the Colonel Zorana, which is not his real last name, but he took it on because of his adventures in Italy. He dressed up as a French lady and kind of fooled everyone. I know it's a long story. I think we will talk about it some other day. Anyway, so he's putting together a fleet, and we call it a mosquito fleet. He has the CSS Calhoun, which is flagship, CSS Jackson, CSS Pickens, CSS Tuscarora, CSS Ivy, and CSS Moray. Now, these are all paddle-driven small tugs and small river steamers, and he'll slap a gun on them. He'll reinforce the bow so they can be a ram. But he really wanted to have more ships. Now, I got to tell you, one of his ships, the Morale, is actually the former Mexican warship Marquis de Havana, which was captured by the USS Saratoga during the Battle of Anton Lazaro, which happened, of course, in March of 1860. There was revolts in Mexico, and so we had to take sides, and so we captured these rebel ships, so to speak. So the big thing is that the U.S. Navy, now we all know about the Delta, and we can see the main passes that are going into. So right here is the head of the passes. And it's there because this is where the main entrances into the Mississippi River come. And so they actually, the Union will decide that they want to take action. They want to blockade New Orleans. And the only way to blockade New Orleans is to get ships up to the head of the passes. No one can slip past Confederate ships once they're there. Now, so they bring the CSS of the side wheeler USS Powhatan and the steam frigates Niagara, Minnesota. They arrive, but guess what? They could only blockade the outlets. They couldn't get into the river because of the sandbars. Now, the squadron was commanded by one person that you'll forget soon. His name is Captain William W. McKean. He's a War of 1812 veteran, hero, like he was an old tar of the old school, blustering his way across the oceans. So he was in command of the squadron off of the Delta. Now, he knows he's got to take ships up to the head of the passes. So he will actually have a flotilla of 4 ships commanded by a man known as John Pope of the CSS Richmond. Now, I got to tell you, John Pope had been in the Navy 52 years. McKean was very sickly and was in the Navy for 57 years. So, in other words, they've been serving a long time. And this is the problem with the U.S. Navy at the time, the seniority system. Seniority system said, well, if I can stay in the Navy as long as I want, because there's no retirement. And so that's why you had officers in their 60s and 70s still serving during the beginning of the Civil War. Now, basically, McKean is going to receive 4 ships, and the commander of one of them, USS Richmond, is John Pope. The Richmond is part of the Hartford class of steam screw sloops with 24 guns, and that makes it a pretty powerful item. And it actually had 14 9-inch dog runs, so that's pretty good. Now, that ship alone could blow Holland's ships out of the water. Now, also the steamer was joined by sailing sloops, the Vincennes, the Preble, and also the side-wheeler gunboat, the USS Water Witch, 10 guns. Now, here we have the Manassas, and the Manassas is the Confederates send the CSS Ivy down the river, see what the Federals are doing. And the Ivy had rifled guns on board, which the Federals had old shell guns, and so they did not have the range. The Ivy goes down, fires at the Federal ships. John Pope complains at how unfair it is. No, he really did in the dispatch. They are unfair in how they're using destructive weapons. And so that was on 9 October. Now, the rifled guns show that they totally unnerve Pope, and he wants to abandon the head of the passes because he thought it was untenable. He was ordered to stay in place despite his fears of assault by a stronger force. Now, meanwhile, on 10 October, Holland sends Lieutenant Alexander Warley to actually take over the CSS, what will become the CSS Manassas. It's owned by these private citizens, but Warley comes on, he's got a Colt revolver, says this is now Confederate property. They said, oh, no, you don't. Points the gun. They said, oh, yes, you do. And so it's kind of simple as 1, 2, 3. And so that becomes the main vessel of this fleet. But Warley will call it the Manassas a bugbear, no power, no speed, no strength of resistance, no armament. Nevertheless, he assembles a crew and wants to use it as quickly as possible. On the early morning of October 11th, 1861, Holland heads down the river, and it was very dark. The moon had set, the mist hanging low over the river, as Holland later wrote. And so his ships are unseen by the Federals as they come down. So about 4:40 a.m., the Richmond was loading coal when the Manassas peered out of the mist and tries to ram the Richmond. The trouble is, the Richmond has a coal barge known as the Tune next to it, and so the Manassas rams the coal bar and barely hits the Richmond, However, the Manassas loses its ram. It has its smokestack fall off, because just think of the jam that happens, and has to limp away, one of its two engines no longer working. And so, but the big thing is that Manassas has struck and put fear into the Federal, because once it gets next to the Richmond, they can see this strange contraption. You think they thought the Monitor was strange? This ship equals that. And I have to say, so basically, a Pope is going to, they let loose fire rafts, which they send down river. And those fire rafts are going to make everyone panic. And the panic is going to cause the Richmond Vincennes to try to escape. They run across a bar, and only one ship, the Preble, reaches the safety of the Gulf of Mexico. I got to tell you, basically, the Vincennes sends a message to the Richmond, Captain Pope, and says, "What should we do? We'll run aground." And the signals are misunderstood, says abandoned ship, destroy your ship, right? Now, the Confederates really don't have much going on. And so what's going to happen is that when the crew rows over to the Richmond, Pope says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "You told us to abandon the ship, and we have a fuse over there." He says, "Go back there, put out the fuse, and we're not going to surrender." But they do escape into the Gulf of Mexico. And what this does is shows the Federals how dangerous this Manassas is, because they think the Manassas was everywhere, right? Now, it wasn't. This is Warley, who actually, he was one of the most court-martialed officers in the old U.S. Navy before the war, because he was insubordinate, all those types of things, but he was quite a fierce commander. Now, one ship it's going to meet is going to be the Mississippi during the Battle of New Orleans. Now, you all can see the Manassas right here, right? It looks like it's got a lot of guns, but it didn't. And so the Manassas, of course, has that one gun. And so what happens is that Farragut and his stepbrother, David Dixon Porter, will plan to run past the forts, Fort St. Philip and Fort Jackson, right? These mount 117 guns. They're pretty powerful brick fortifications. However, since the advent of steam power and rifle guns and shell guns, the bricks can't withstand the type of shot. Plus, you can run past the forts. See, in the old days, during the War of 1812, the British tried to capture Fort St. Philip, and they anchored off the fort and tried to fire into it. The fort fires back, damages several British ships, and so the British go away. So what this means now is that with the steam power, I can cruise my ships back in a certain amount of time. Farragut divides his force into 3 divisions, and with the Hartford at 2 a.m. hosts 2 lanterns and for them to get underway. The battle quickly erupted in all its fury, and Farragut remembered as if the artillery of heaven was playing upon the earth. The darkness of the night made eerie by the Confederates have these bonfires on the side, so it really lights up all the Union ships. Now, many of the Union ships were struck by, shells and damage. They don't do very well. They have an ironclad, also the Louisiana there, but it has no motive power. So the Manassas is going to be the key vessel. This is the first ironclad of the Civil War. And so what's going to happen is that Warley, as he watches all these other gunboats be sunk, he is going to take his ship and he tries to ram both the Cayuga and the Pensacola. He misses them, right? And remember, he goes 4 to 6 knots. A steam screw sloop, Hartford class, goes about 8 knots. So you can avoid them fairly easily. So then Warley decides, I'm going to hit the Mississippi, because Mississippi is a paddle wheeler. So he figures, I'm going to ram that paddle wheel. That ship will be disabled. Well, I have to tell you, at the wheel at that time is someone who's going to become very famous. His name is George Dewey. George Dewey, famous for Manila Bay, on the Olympia, Fire When Ready, Gridley. Well, he's a tough guy in 1862. This is April 1862. He's at the wheel and he sees this contraption coming towards him. So he turns his ship away so that the Manassas misses the paddle wheel. However, it glanced off the frigate's port forward. Dewey looked down the side of his vessel as the ram steamed away and saw that the Manassas had ripped off planking, leaving exposed the gleaming ends of copper bolts, cut as clean as if they were hair under a razor's edge. Wow, so in other words, the ram has the ability to really do damage to these wooden ships. It's going downriver right now, so it's picked up some speed. So then the Warley sends his ship, the Manassas, after the Hartford. And they sent message to let go fire rafts. So here comes down the river fire rafts. Here comes the Manassas. It tries to ram the Hartford, and it missed, believe it or not. But the fire rafts did not. The Hartford gets into a configuration. However, the Mosher, which is supporting the fire rafts, gets blown out of the water by the Hartford, and they were able to push the rafts away. Actually, the Hartford is scorched. Now, just believe it or not, over the din of the battle, just as Farragut would do elsewhere, he used a speaking trumpet and shouted over to Melicon Smith, commander of the Mississippi, "Sink that rascally rebel ram," So in other words, the Mississippi knows we're going to go after that boat. And so Dewey, like the Manassas is going downriver, Dewey's heading upriver, so he stops one wheel and turns his vessel on a dime and goes after Manassas. Manassas now is turned around trying to go upriver, and the sad thing is going upriver is very hard for this ship, because of its bad engines. And so the Mississippi will come by and basically Dewey will back the ship around, and when they hit towards the Manassas, they forced it onto a riverbank where the Mississippi riddled the ram, leaving it helpless with smoke pouring out of fresh punctures, which appeared to be portholes. And actually, Dewey will say, I left it helpless with new portholes. And that was a report. So the ship then drifts downriver and will explode. The Manassas tells us a great deal about the Civil War. Number one, it gives us this concept that wooden ships really are no longer, I mean, they get used throughout the war, but you got to have ironclads to defend your ports. You got to have ironclads to be able to turn the table. Now, just remember, 24 April 1862 is 6 weeks after the Battle of Hampton Roads. So now we're starting to see that the ram is now really feared because the Virginia had rammed, of course, the USS Cumberland. The Manassas, in turn, is a feared weapon, but is more a flash of the pan than anything else. The Confederates realize they have to mobilize their industries to produce more ironclads. And it's something they really will never be able to do sufficiently.
But thanks again for joining us. Please have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much for your continued support.
Thank you.